Hey guys, Joe Sidoti here. Thanks for watching. In this video, I'm going to walk you through 5 tips and tricks on how to make sure that you can hear bass guitar through small speakers. And stay till the end because I'm going to show you a trick that is a fail-safe on how to always get your bass at the perfect level. So that's right now. Okay, so you clicked on the video, you heard the topic, so let's get down to the nitty-gritty, which is how can I hear bass through small speakers? It really isn't complicated, but there are some specific things that you sort of kind of must do in order for you to be able to hear bass guitar, low frequencies on small speakers, which is kind of an oxymoron if you think about it, but we're going to get there. So let's go over step 1. Bass is all about mids. Wait, what? Does that make sense? Yes, I'll explain. Okay, bass guitar, you know, is mostly low frequencies, right? So let's say you've got a set of small speakers, a clock radio, headphones, whatever, right? A Bluetooth little speaker. It can't reproduce low frequencies. So how do you make sure that you can hear the bass guitar? Well, it's all about the mids in this case. So let me show you, first of all, this song is by Dustin Burke. The artist is Dustin Burke, and it's called Run For Your Life. I'll put a link in the description to some of Dustin's streaming channels, if you will. Really good stuff. I love working with him. Let's hear a little bit of the song. I'll just start where the drums come in, and then you'll see here is when the bass starts. So let's listen to that real quick. Okay, so, you know, I don't think this, I opened this session, kind of made some edits to it, and so this isn't the final mix that got put out on iTunes and Spotify and all that, but it's close enough for government work. All right, so you just heard the bass, how I have it in the final mix, and so I've got some plugins on there, and so now what I want to do is we're gonna here, I'm gonna command click those, and now they're bypassed. I want to show you what I mean by mid-range being the key. So I'm gonna open up, let's see, bass, boom. So I'm going to, now this plugin's bypassed, right? So you're not gonna see this, but I'll go ahead and pull this flat. Boom, boom. Okay, let's go back and let's start at this chorus because that seems to be a good spot. So as you can see, there's a whole bunch of information in the lows, and then starting about 500 or so, I mean, it just goes away. Let's go ahead and solo the bass now that you've kind of heard what the song sounds like. And this is, by the way, just a DI. There's no amp, there's no simulated amp. It's straight up one channel of bass soloed. Let's hear that again. Okay, I mean, it doesn't sound bad. Just if I were to play it now with all of these bypass, let's see what that sounds like. All three plugins bypass, here's the whole mix. I'm struggling to hear the bass. My first instinct would be, okay, it needs to be louder. Well, if I turn it up louder, you're just gonna get a whole bunch more of this, right? Which really can't be heard through small speakers. So let's solo the bass up again and start adding some of that mid-range that I had, because you need to be able to hear the bass. Bass can't always be about you feeling the bass, if that makes any sense. So let's EQ the bass a little bit. And I chose what, about 900 or so. To me, that already sounds better. I mean, when you solo a bass and you add a bunch of 900, all of a sudden it starts to sound like punk rock Green Day. But it's all about, and I mean, sometimes that's actually killer. It just depends on the genre, obviously. But sounds like he's playing with his fingers. You know, if I wanted more mid-range, I was producing this mix, I probably would have said, hey, let's have you use a pick on such a driving song. Because if you use the pick, then I don't even need to add most of this mid-range EQ. It's already built in, and that's kind of the beauty of playing with a pick. But so I've added a bunch of mid-range here, 900 hertz ish, 9.5 dB. I mean, whatever. I don't care what this looks like. I just listen and I decide whether I want more. So at this point, I would leave this. I'd go back into the mix, and I would maybe decide whether it needs more EQ in the mix. So let's do that. We'll unsolo and... Okay, so in the mix, it was better, but man, it really needed this 3K-ish. Okay, because what it was to me was the growliness of the strings, especially when he went higher up. It really made those higher notes stand out to me. So you can do some EQing when it's soloed, but it really makes way more sense to make final EQ decisions. Sorry, I was covering my mic. In the mix, it is going to be much better for you. So that's step one, right? You got to add mid-range to bass to be able to hear it. So let's do a before and after real quick, and I'm going to bypass the plugin, unbypass. So let's start with it bypassed, and I'll bring it in and out a couple times so you can hear the difference of just this EQ that is, by the way, on the Softube Console 1 SSL emulation, which I can't say enough good things about. So let's hear that. Yeah, and I really noticed it there at the end of the turn. It's when he goes up higher, you know, those notes would be lost otherwise. But because we've added the mid-range, you know, you can really hear the intricacies of the tone, the sound, and what he's playing. All right, so that's step one. Here we go. Step number two. All right, step number two is distortion. Okay, distortion makes your bass audible, specifically harmonics of your bass frequencies, the harmonics, the upper harmonics. So I've got a plugin here from Waves called R-Bass. Okay, and what R-Bass is a distortion harmonics adder, right? So you pick the fundamental frequency, which in this case, at the moment, I've got it at 90. And then you start adding, all the way from -24, you're already adding intensity of those harmonics. And you can choose to leave the original bass in, which I almost always do. And then you can adjust the output, you know, compensate for any volume, you know, that's been added because of the harmonics. So let me play you what that does. I'll start with it off, and then we'll turn on the harmonics here, and which is adding a level of distortion. But wait, there's more. I've got more distortion to add. So let's listen to this. The whole point here, let's read this real quick just so you can see. It's a perfect explanation here. So it says, it lets you accurately reproduce low frequency sounds on playback systems that cannot handle low frequency signals. With Renaissance bass, even bass-rich songs can be played through speakers that are too small, too inefficient, or up to a point, too cheap to reproduce deep sounds. What's the secret? Every sound has a fundamental, the lowest frequency from which harmonics are generated. The complexities of these harmonics help your brain distinguish instruments from one another and provide the information you need to faithfully experience the rich world of sounds. Yeah. That's all. See, here's the fun part. Here's a really cool part. The brain, however, can reconstruct a missing fundamental from just the harmonics the ear is hearing. So what is that? I sometimes call that, as a matter of fact, the guy who I interned with 20 plus years ago would have a term that he called sympathetic harmonics. Basically, it's let's say you have an 18-inch floor tom and you hit it and there's actually no bottom end to it, but there's harmonics, and your brain thinks that it hears a bigness when you go from 12 to 14 to 16 to then 18, even though there might be actually less bottom end because maybe the mic couldn't handle it or the speaker can't reproduce it. It still sounds like a bigger drum because of the harmonics. And so it's these things, it's these connections that your brain makes that says, I can hear that, even though you're not hearing the actual fundamental note. So that's why I've got this right at about 90. And let's see what that sounds like. And I'll go in and out when I add the R-Bass. Okay, so it's subtle, but it's there. I'm hearing it a little bit better. Now, I'm actually listening to this in my room right now without my subwoofer on, just so I can make sure that I'm hearing it through smaller speakers. So I'm mixing on some near fields, and I also have a 12-inch sub. I'll even turn the sub on. It won't make a difference because what we're dealing with right now is not affecting the sub frequencies, right? That's the whole point. is we got to pretend like we don't have a sub. Now, we're going to get into what to do when you do have a sub in just a minute. But for now, that is the R bass, so that has added some distortion. So let's go to the next step and let's bring up, what's this called? Omni something, Shep's Omni Channel. Okay, I really like this plugin because of this saturation, and it just makes it really easy to bring up the detail and some of that stuff. All I'm using this for is the saturation and then a compressor. Because believe it or not, I mean, as you can see, this really is pretty dang compressed from, you know, to tape. And there's a few peaks here and there, but it's nothing that, you know, can't be easily tamed. So it just doesn't need a crap ton of compression. Let's see what this thing does when I add. Mostly we're listening for the saturation. Now I did adjust the output, so it should be right about the same output when I unbypass it, but let's listen. And then I'll play that for you soloed. First bypassed. So what I'm hearing when I do this, and hopefully you're listening through good speakers or through headphones, but what I'm hearing is it doesn't get any louder, there's no more volume, but my headroom has gone up because the distortion and the compressor has brought the peaks down, and so its apparent volume is louder, even though it's actually not getting any louder on a dB, you know, meter, if you will, or on a VU meter. So this again is subtle, but when you add all three together, you know, that's when the magic really happens. Let's listen to the bass again, soloed first with all three and bypassed, and then I'll turn them on and we'll listen to the whole difference. So here's without anything. Okay, and with. Okay, so that is step 2, distortion, helping make it be more audible. Now, here we go. We're talking about that subwoofer. Here's step 3. Okay, step 3 is if you have a subwoofer, I do what's called a high pass check. All right, so what I mean by that is, let's say you don't have a way to turn your sub on or off. Then the high pass check works even more. But if you have an on and off, I've got ABC. I've got my NS10s on A, my JBLs on B, and my subwoofer on C. So I can turn the sub off anytime I want, which is what I do when I'm setting the volume of my bass, when I'm really getting an idea of, can I hear the bass? So this step though, step 3, is all about what happens when you get the volume right and then you turn on your sub and you find that it is booming out the wazoo. Okay, let's talk about that. I'm gonna pretend like I don't have a sub, or I can't turn the sub off, right? So I'm going to emulate not having a sub, and I'm gonna high pass at, let's just say 100, okay? Most small speakers, even like 5.5 inch, are gonna do a pretty decent job at 100. And I wanna listen to my bass there in the mix and make sure I'm happy with the volume. And then when I get the volume right, I wanna make sure that when I bring the bottom end back, that it's not too loud. And if it is, I'll show you what you need to do. So let's hear what it sounds like with literally a high pass at 100, no sub frequencies. Ah, thing of beauty. It actually sounds great. There's so much beef from the kick drum that, again, kind of those sympathetic harmonics, and your brain is if the kick and bass are tight, if the rhythm section are tight, this is fairly tight, the perceived bottom end, combined between the kick and the bass are going to sound fine. But let's say, just for argument's sake, this is the high pass trick, okay? That you got it sounding great, and as soon as you take off this high pass filter here, I've got a knob, so I'm turning it. As soon as you take that off, you now have got way too much sub frequency. So I'm going to show you what you need to do is you just need to put a shelf, okay? You can high pass, but high pass, is really, when I think of the high pass, I don't want the bass to go any lower than this, because of the genre or because of other things in the mix that I want to take up that subwoofer space. Maybe a synth bass I want to really go low, but my electric bass I want it to not have some of those low frequencies doubled up, so I'll high pass it. But more so if it's just rock and roll, I don't really high pass the bass. But here's the trick if you have too much bass, is you want to use a shelf. And you want to turn the whole section like that down. You do not want to use a bell curve unless it's really, really, really wide. But even still, that's really surgical. And when you've just got too much bottom end, that's not really surgery. That's just molding of clay, right? So if you use a bell curve, you're only going to be EQing, adding or subtracting certain notes. And so now as the bass player is going up and down playing different notes, some of those notes are going to be louder than others, and you're going to actually make the bass sound inconsistent. Now it's a whole nother video to talk about how to fix that. If the bass has that inherently, well then you can figure out which notes are too low, and you can use bell curves to make those notes louder. But for this video, we're talking about the bass is too loud and how do we make it not too much bottom end so we can hear the bass and not just feel the bass. And that would be the shelf, because you're pulling all the frequencies from 128 in this case down. You're pulling them all down, so you're evenly lowering all the notes, all the fundamentals together. So that's really it. There's not a whole lot of rocket science to that. And of course, if the bass wasn't loud enough, I would do the same thing. I would add the shelf so that I'm just shifting the weight of the bass. Here's the gist. If I've been rambling, so if you take anything from step 3, take this. Make sure your bass volume is good without the subwoofer, without the low frequencies. Make sure you can hear it, and then as you bring the sub frequencies back in, determine whether they're too loud or not compared to what you just had without the sub. Does that make sense? So you get the mids right, the high mids right, the low mids right. You get the bass sitting in the mix where you want. Then when you bring the subwoofer back in or the sub frequencies back in, if they're way too loud, don't reach for the fader and pull your bass down. You just spent time getting it right. Just deal with those frequencies. Does that make sense? Okay, that segues perfectly into step number 4. Cue the graphic. Okay, step number 4, you want to hear bass through small speakers. Well, then it should stand to reason you should listen through small speakers. And I'll go one step further, at low volumes. Okay, this is almost exclusively why I still use NS10s. Yeah, I'm used to how they sound, but I honestly don't do the majority of my mixing anymore on them. I used to, and then I used to check my mixes on other stuff. And I've gotten to a point where I've done enough treatment in my room, everything's great. So I tend to mix on other speakers and check things on my NS10s. Regardless, however, I'm always mixing at a very low level. I'm talking 70 dB, A-weighted, no more than 75. I mean, they say 85 is good. I don't even go that far. Sometimes I will. I'll freaking rock it out just because I want to hear, just super hype. But I don't want to be tricked into thinking that the mix sounds better. And so small speakers, low volume, this is the key to your mix translating. So I will turn my subwoofer off. I will turn on the NS10s. I will turn them down, and I will listen at a very low volume. I'll sit here and I'll say, can I hear this? Can I hear that? And I listen, and that's my clock radio, if you will. There's other, Oratones are the popular one where people do, heck, someday I wish I had some barefoot speakers and I could go through the different modes and I wouldn't even have to have multiple pairs of speakers. But that is the key to step 4, to hearing bass on small speakers. Then you need to listen to it and check your mix on small speakers, specifically at a low volume. If you can hear your bass at a low volume, you can hear your bass at any volume on any speaker. And then go back to step 3. If when you go back to large speakers, there's way too much sub, then go back to step 3. Okay, that's step 4. Pretty simple. All right, are you ready for the 5th and final step? Here we go. Cue graphic. So step 5 is a trick. I didn't come up with this. I've seen several dudes on the internet talk about this, but it is absolutely true. Let me bring up my little VU meter. By the way, can I just rabbit trail here for a second? If you didn't know this already, 0 VU is -18 digital, okay? I almost exclusively use VU meters in Pro Tools, even though it's digital. I treat everything coming into Pro Tools as if 0 is pretty good. +3 is like, wow, you've literally pegged the needle. You're +3, which is actually only what, 18, 17, -15. Sorry, I'm really bad at math. -15. But when, so anyways, sorry, rabbit hole. So point is, I've got the headroom set at -18. So when this VU meter hits 0, we're at -18. That's just a side note. Okay, so you can see this a little bit better. I'll go nice and big. Here's the trick. Step number 5. It's how to get your bass to sit at the absolute perfect volume in comparison to your kick drum. Okay, so it's called the 3 dB trick. Essentially, what you do is you put a meter on your kick drum, okay, and you see where the meter is hitting. And then when you add your bass guitar, when it couples with the kick drum, it should go up about 3 dB. Okay, and when it does, and when you've got that marriage right, you can kind of rest assured that compared to your kick drum, your bass guitar is good. So now if at that point you wanted to maybe even group those and go up and down, but it's usually a lot easier to decide whether you have enough kick drum. It's like, yeah, that sounds good. That's where I want my kick. But how many times, I know I have you gone back and listened to your mix and realize either there's nowhere near enough bass, I can't even hear it, or there's way too much bass, I don't know what I was thinking. Of course, there's all sorts of things that could play into that, but if you did this check, chances are you'd be a whole lot closer. So let's do it. Let's solo the kick and let's see where it hits on the meter. Okay, so it's averaging, I'd say it's averaging around -4. So that would mean that if I add the bass and it's averaging around -1, that's essentially where I want this VU meter to go. So let's play that same stretch and we will add the bass. So that got us hitting up to about the -1 spot, you know, and so that's the check. You check the kick drum. Now that was without the kick out, you know, which has the sub kick on it and all that sort of stuff. That's a whole nother video on why I left that out. So I just did the inside kick, which still has bottom end. It just doesn't have some of the sub frequencies, which can really affect a VU meter big time. So I did just the main kick drum and the bass guitar, the bass DI. And then I simply, in my mix, compare the kick out channel with the kick in channel, and I get that where I want. I make sure it's in phase and all that whatnots. So that is the 3 dB trick, and that's really it. There's not a whole lot more to it. So let's recap. Let me go through my notes here. Okay, step 1, mid-range is the key to bass. It's the oxymoron, but it's true. If you want to hear your bass, you need to make sure there is mid-range in there. And yeah, mid-range. Okay, distortion. Step number 2 was distortions. Distortion makes the bass audible, right? It brings it out, the harmonics, all of that. It makes it so that you can hear the bass. On top of the mids, you now add the distortion and the harmonics, and it'll make it even more audible through small speakers. We talked about if you have a subwoofer, if you don't have a subwoofer, how to deal with that, how to set the volume. If you can't turn off the bottom end in your room, if you have, you know, large speakers, if you have a sub and you can't turn it off, high pass the bass, get it where you're happy with the volume, then bring the bottom end back in and decide whether it needs the high shelf cut or not, or boost. And then 4, listen through small speakers at a low volume. I can't stress that one enough. If all you did was step number 4, listen to the bass through small speakers at a low volume, and if you can get it to where you can hear the bass on small speakers at a low volume, guess what? You're going to hear the bass everywhere. Now, there is the sub frequencies you have to work with, which is why there were other steps. But and then the 5th point was just a little added trick is, how do I know that I really have got the bass at the right volume? I'm good with the tone, I can hear it, but compared to other things, how do I do it? So that's the 3 dB VU meter trick. And it doesn't matter, by the way, where it hits on that VU meter. It doesn't have to hit -5. It doesn't matter. Just that when the kick hits, you are able to tell where that's hitting. Is it this way? This way? And then when the bass gets added, that it's 3 dB more. That's all that matters. So That's it, guys. Man, I really hope, you liked this video. Matter of fact, if you did, go ahead and like it and subscribe to the channel. This helps me so I know that you're digging what I'm putting out, and I can make more videos like this. So I appreciate you watching. I appreciate your time. I hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you on the next video.